Chapter 13. Meiling hurtled through the air as fast as she could back to the campsite. Please let it not be too late. Please let it not be too late. When she got closer, orange glowed so brilliantly it almost concealed the bird-like feathered body that hovered dangerously over the campsite. Its wings of flame dissipated into smoke, its beak dripping fire and snapping in anticipation of the kill. A phoenix. Meiling's heart almost stopped. She had to resist the terror that tried to pull her spirit back into her body. The phoenix couldn't see her, so she fled past it, through the treetops, and burst into the campsite. Shang lay sprawled where she'd left him, asleep by her tent. Fen's head leaned heavily on her fist, elbow propped on her knee, with her eyes shut and soft snores escaping her throat. Bo sprawled spread eagle at her feet, his fluffy white belly upturned. They were utterly helpless against the circling predatory monster. She couldn't warn them. She had to rush to her body and scream for them to wake up before the phoenix could... It dove. Straight for Fen. Meiling acted before she thought. She sent her spirit hurling into Fen's mind. And found herself floating in a vast, wild field. In the distance, the rooftops of a village were visible. Gray sky cast overhead. Long stalks of brown grass waved beneath. There was no sign of the phoenix, of the campsite, of a sleeping Shang. "Phoenix!" Meiling screamed in Fen's mind. "Wake up!" Suddenly, Fen's eyes opened, and it was like Meiling saw double. The grassy field and the campfire. One blink, and she was seeing outside Fen's eyes. A second blink, and she floated under cloudy sky. Rapid-fire thoughts burst through Fen's mind. Except they weren't articulated thoughts. They were instincts. "Mwagway! Roll! Duck! Monster! 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 Kill the monster!" Fen's body reacted to the heat of a narrowly missed burst of flame and claws from the phoenix. Meiling felt Fen's tension, felt how her training overtook her limbs, felt the sudden burst of thrill and adrenaline. "Shang! I need to wake Shang!" thought Fen with a burst, her voice echoing into Meiling's awareness. "Shang! Phoenix!" Fen screamed. Fen turned away from Shang, despite Meiling scrambling to see if he woke. Fen did not doubt that Shang was awake and immediately readied for an attack. But Meiling wasn't so sure. Fen's thoughts had one focus, with no room for anything else. Kill the monster. There was power in Fen's limbs, a feeling so entirely unfamiliar to Meiling. This was what it felt like to be strong. But then an alarmed thought crossed Fen's mind. I can't shift. It was a realization that crashed into Fen's core and echoed into Meiling's. Fen could not shift because it required close combat. And if she got closer to a phoenix, she would burn. The Mwagway was almost more element than physical. The waves of confusion and frantic alarm, mixed with the rush of addicting adrenaline and the thrill of challenge, plowed into Meiling's conscious. Fen was crippled, almost like she'd broken a leg. It frustrated her, but also enthralled her. The next panicked thought, Bo, keep Bo safe. Completely disregarding everything else, Fen swept up the cub in her arms and tossed him into the tent with Meiling, as if that would keep him safe. Then he was gone from her mind. All this happened in milliseconds. Meiling had no use here, not in this strange place, not anymore. With a blink, she launched herself into the gray sky. And found herself flying free in the air above the campsite. She whirled, gaze latching onto the phoenix preparing to dive again. Below, Shang had scrambled to his feet and braced himself for the attack. Fen searched the ground for something. Stones? A long strip of leather dangled from her fingers. A sling. The phoenix dove for Shang's face, a streak of fire in the night sky, brilliant and deadly. He hurled an ice bolt at the oncoming blast of fire. Then he leapt out of the way, and the phoenix screeched an ear-splitting cry as it narrowly avoided crashing into the ground. The force of that cry shattered into the spirit dimension where Meiling floated. To her horror, her soul tether trembled, as if it were about to break. A new fear tore into her heart. The thought hadn't even occurred to her before. Could her tether be broken? She couldn't break it, but could others, like the phoenix, break it? What happened if it broke? Leather cracked below her, and Fen sent rock after rock hurtling toward the blazing phoenix. It wheeled around too fast for her and almost chomped its beak down on her neck. But in a flash, she shifted into a tiger and the phoenix missed. Fen swiped a claw-tipped paw at the phoenix with a roar. She tore through flames and yelped, shifting immediately back into human form, and clutched her hand. Shang flung bolt after bolt at the beast, his face twisted in focus and heat as he fought. His bolts were the biggest she had ever seen him throw, both thicker and longer. He hurled them like javelins into the sky. If he had hope of any ice piercing through flaming feathers to tender flesh, he had to make them bigger. But such a weapon was unwieldy. The phoenix whirled and wheeled, snapping and flaming. Fen and Shang were both disadvantaged in this fight. Neither could use their weapons and magic as they were accustomed. Shang switched from ice bolts to a jian. He slammed 2 arrows into the shaft. "Distract it!" he called to Fen. "I'm trying!" Fen shouted back, diving to avoid being annihilated by a searing burst of flame. She rolled into a crouch, swung her sling, and launched her projectile. It hit the phoenix's feet, making the Mwagwe let out another soul-shattering screech. Meiling clung to her tether as the dangerous tremors reverberated through her spirit hands. Shang took aim. Something fiery dove from above. A second phoenix. And then Meiling was diving faster, desperate to reach him before the second phoenix did. She tore into his mind, landing in a wide, vast hall. It was barren, dark. The ornate curtains flowing from the towering ceiling all the way to the polished floor were drawn across the windows. Pillars with winding, curling decorative dragons lined the huge empty space. "Roll to the side!" Meiling screamed in Shang's mind. Confusion rippled through the room, and Meiling's vision switched to Shang's as he took aim at the first phoenix. "Second phoenix is diving for you! Move!" Fen's scream, echoing through the cavernous room, was what finally made Shang dive and narrowly avoid being decimated by the second phoenix's fatal blow. Heat blasted through his body, but just missed him. The thoughts roiling through Shang's body felt, for felt was a better description than sounded, much different from Fen's. He constantly took stock of the battle. "Fen there. The first phoenix there. The second about to dive again. At Fen. I can hit it." Meiling saw through Shang's eyes the sights on the jian he held. The weight was familiar in his hands as he calculated exactly where to aim, when to take a shot, noting the Mwagwe's speed so his arrows did not miss. He released the string. As soon as he did, frustration flooded his body. Not close enough. One dart struck the low underbelly of the second phoenix, but the other barely missed. A second earlier, and it would be dead. Pain flared in his shoulder, sharp, burning pain. He shoved it away without a consideration as his eyes roved the battleground. "Fen!" He blasted a wave of ice just above Fen as both phoenixes bellowed fire toward her. The ice evaporated instantly, but it gave Fen the split second to roll out of the way. Power coursed in his limbs as he carefully calculated every use of his magic, almost measuring the size, the temperature of his ice. "The girl! Where is Meiling?" The thought shot through his mind with something akin to panic. "Find Meiling!" Shang shouted to Fen. "Guard her!" "No!" Meiling cried in his mind. "They can't see me! They don't know I'm here too! Leave me!" Shang's arrows careened wide as an avalanche of confusion rolled over him. Fen was already going to obey, leading the firebirds right to Meiling's prone body and exposing their vulnerability. Meiling tore through the ceiling of Shang's mindscape and darted into Fen's. She hurled down through a gray-cast sky. "Ignore Shang!" she shouted. "Fight! Kill! It is better if the phoenixes don't know about Meiling." A flash of inarticulate confusion. Then Fen whirled on her foot and slung a stone straight into a phoenix's open mouth. Now that is a shot. Fen's satisfaction flooded every inch of her body with electricity. The phoenix sputtered on its own flame and lost its balance. Before Fen could load and launch another stone, 2 arrows struck the phoenix's flaming neck. The phoenix froze mid-flight and fell. Fen's body exploded in thrill and adrenaline. Pride, too. But this rush, this high that Fen felt it was pure exhilaration. This was why she loved killing Mwagwe. Fen was already swinging her sling toward the second phoenix, but Meiling flew out of Fen's head as the deafening snap of a soul tether tore through the ether. The writhing spirit rose out of the mass of feathers and sputtering flame. It was enormous. The long, shapeless mass kept rising. It snapped an owl-like gaze at her.
"You protect them,"
it accused. Its voice, if it could be called a voice, was not furious. It was far darker, far deadlier.
"I will break your tether and bring you with me."
"You cannot break it," Meiling said.
"No, but my master can."
There was a flash in that massive black shadow, a flash of blue fire, and then the shade was dragged upward, far away from Meiling. When she pulled her gaze away from it, the second firebird was nowhere to be seen. She shot upward in the air, just to make sure nothing glowed nearby. There, getting smaller on the horizon, being swallowed up by the night, was a hiccuping glow. The one Shang shot but hadn't killed. It fled. Fen and Shang, chests heaving, stared at one another. Shang sat down heavily, a hand drifting toward his injured shoulder. Fen plopped across from him, her singed hair sticking up at weird angles, her eyes alight with wildness.
"Are you hurt?"
he asked her. She shrugged and hid her burned palm close to her leg. "Nothing I can't take care of." Meiling wanted to enter Fen's mind again, just to see if she felt any guilt for falling asleep on guard. But she restrained herself. She would not gratuitously exercise her magic. Her magic. The battle delayed the shock of her realization, but now it hit her full force. She could enter people's minds. She could enter their minds, feel their thoughts. She remembered Fen's bleak mindscape of a gray and brown field, Shang's gloomy, stately hall with drawn curtains.
"Check on the girl. I'll grab the medical supplies,"
Shang said, already turning toward the horses.
"Then you'll have to scout to ensure the coast is clear."
Fen bristled under his order, but obeyed. She strode toward Meiling's tent, not caring to quiet her footsteps. She flung open the flap, and her lips parted in a snarl, then let the flap fall closed. "The girl sleeps soundly along with the stupid panda," she announced, shaking her head while tilting her eyebrow in scorn. "All that racket, and she sleeps through it. Reason number 152 she would make a terrible warrior." Shang's head shot up from the saddlebags. Even the darkness couldn't hide the sudden pallor of his face.
"She is still asleep? She is alive, right?"
"Yes, she's breathing." He blinked, looking off into the dark forest. He grew quiet, thoughtful. That gleaming light returned to his eye. His fingers slowed their work until they stopped entirely. He stood so still, so contemplative. What was he thinking? She could find out. Her fingertips buzzed with the realization of her unexplored magic. It would be so easy. She could prepare herself for whatever he would say or ask tomorrow. She would not be startled as she'd been when he threatened her after she bound his wound. No. She would not do it. She would not give in to these urges. Their minds were not hers to explore. Would she want them rifling through her mind? No, of course not. She had already invaded their minds out of necessity. She would only do so when they had no other option. She fluttered above the campsite while Shang bent over the charred remains of the firebird.
2 of them,
he muttered. Aye, and we killed one for sure. The second may still die.
When have 2 phoenixes ever been seen in the same vicinity?
Shang asked, thoughtful again. He shook his head.
Something is strange about this.
Fen was busy nursing her hand with salve and fresh bandages, but she looked up. When she cocked her head, her features flickered, and she looked like a questioning, ear-raised wolf. You're right. That was very strange. What could it mean? Shang holstered his jian and replaced it in his belt with his knives.
My guess is that we'll find out sooner rather than later.
His gaze flicked to the tent, his brow tightening. That cunning light returned to his eyes, replaced by what could possibly be a flash of understanding. Something tightened in Meiling's stomach, something deep and foreboding. Had he figured it out? Unconsciously, she drew away from the fire. She didn't want to leave them again, in case another moi gui happened upon them. But she also didn't want to hear them continue to talk, too afraid of what they might say. She stayed near enough to spot any glowing mass, but she tangled herself into a denser part of the forest where she was more alone. Here, she could fortify herself for whatever Shang would do in the morning. Chapter 14. Meiling took a few minutes after she woke up to braid her hair, straighten her tunic, and tie up her bedroll. Bo sat in the corner of the tent, watching her with slowly blinking eyes, his bandage slipping down his belly. Outside, the early morning birds chirruped and whistled, one to another. The fire crackled, followed by a hiss as someone poured water on it. She bent and pulled back the canvas flap so she could slip into the dawn. And immediately froze. Fen and Shang both stared at her. Shang smiled, something she had never seen in full. This was not a true smile, however. This was the smile of a cat cornering a mouse and gearing up to torment it before devouring it. His smile might have made him more handsome had its danger not completely counterbalanced the effect.
Good morning, Highness,
he said.
Come, eat. We ride soon.
A wolfish sort of tension lined Fen's face. They sat on the ground waiting for her beside the doused fire. Around the campsite were patches of blackened ground, where every living thing had been annihilated by phoenix fire. Meiling's eyes darted around the camp, back to the 2 tall, seated forms eyeing her like prey. Bo hopped out of the tent, bounding straight to Fen and wrapping himself around her boot. She kicked him away. He only came back, hugging on tighter. Any other day, Meiling might have smiled. They could not hurt her. Not while their mission was to deliver her hale and whole to the fortress for safekeeping. Despite that, a shiver ran down her spine. She paused, still bent in the doorway of the tent. She looked from Shang to Fen and back again. Shang chuckled.
Come. It's only food.
He knew. He dragon-blasted knew. He had figured it out and now believed he could intimidate her into admission. What's in it? Poison? Meiling asked, refusing to come closer. She braced herself, tightening every muscle to run. Not that she could outrun them. A pang of helplessness flashed through her, but she swallowed it down her knotted throat. Shang gave a short laugh.
You don't have to eat. We can ride now. You choose.
She straightened, her bedroll and blanket tucked under her arm. She decided to not answer and walked straight past them toward her horse, which was already saddled for the day. Their eyes prickled on the back of her neck as she stood on her tiptoes to pack her bedroll and blanket. She was delaying. They knew it too. She turned, crossing her arms over her chest, and arranged her features into a look that she hoped told them she was not scared of them. Shang stood, dawn light caught in his glittering black eyes, the loose fit of his clothes unable to hide the strength of his purposeful movements. A warrior of the academy, their best and brightest. He'd already demonstrated his prowess and power in battle. He was almost menacing as he stared her down, shoulders back and one hand resting on the hilt of his knife. It was positively irritating. He couldn't hurt her. His career would be destroyed forever. He would never risk that. Raising herself up to her full height, she lowered her eyebrows and refused to be intimidated. "You're trying to scare me," she accused, too quietly. "Huh?" Fen barked.
What did you say?
He craned his neck. She swallowed and gritted her teeth. "You're trying to scare me. I don't know why, but that's what you're trying to do." He raised an eyebrow. "There's no need for whatever secret cunning you two are plotting. We can talk about whatever is wrong, like adults," she said, lifting her chin a little more. "I kindly ask you to stop your ruse." Shang met her eyes. Surprise flickered in his gaze, but it was followed by a new light. He was testing her, analyzing her strength of will. "I'll eat while we ride," she said.
Take down the tent, Fen, Shang ordered, keeping his gaze on Meiling.
Fen shot a quick glare at him and then huffed her way to the tent, ignoring the somersaulting panda at her heels. After one long moment, during which Meiling nearly broke his stare half a dozen times, Shang took a step, then another, closing the distance between them, blocking the rising sun with his back. Unintentionally, she curled inward toward her horse, and only realized it when his eyes flicked down, registering her movements. She forced herself to let go of the saddle and face him. "I said, you can stop trying to intimidate me." He grinned, teeth flashing in the early dawn.
The princess needs assistance mounting.
Something flared inside Meiling. A fire, like the one that had coursed through Fen last night. She was angry, furious that he should play such games with her. He might like to see her squirm, might try to intimidate her into telling him a secret, but it was cruel, and Meiling was not completely helpless. She touched the penknife in her sleeve, a tiny weapon that she could not wield effectively, especially against him. But he saw the motion, and she hoped he knew she was serious when she spoke. "Tan Shangdi, if you threaten me, frighten me, or try to coerce me, I will report every instance to my father, the Emperor. He will have your diploma retracted, and you will have no appointment. Your career will be ruined. Do not terrorize me. Understand?" She went almost lightheaded at the rush of blood through her veins as she spoke those quiet words. She'd found her weapon, sharper than Shang's ice shards or Fen's claws. Cursed or not, strong or not, trained or not, academy graduate or not, Meiling was a princess, the daughter of the emperor. She was not helpless. Not now, not ever. Shang blinked, then his eyes narrowed. The princess can mount by herself, thank you, Meiling said, and nodded toward Fen. But your comrade might require assistance with the tent. Shang tilted his head, and his conniving smiles disappeared. The dangerous look in his eye, however, did not. With one swift step, he closed the gap between them, stepping so close to her that they were nearly chest to chest. Meiling stumbled backward into the horse, which stomped a hind hoof in response. Her brow furrowed, her mouth opening to reiterate what she'd just said, apparently he hadn't gotten the message, when his hand darted out and snatched her chin. The breath in her lungs wheezed out in a gasp as his cold fingers tightened their grip. She tried to twist her head away from him, tried not to give in to the sudden bubbling of panic.
Look at me,
he growled. At least that she could ignore. She kept her gaze focused over his shoulder, even when he tilted her chin up toward his face.
Look at me.
No.
Look at me, Meiling.
The last was spoken with such authority, she flinched. She didn't want to. Father, she hated herself for how her eyes lifted to his like a penitent child's. She was certain her terror was clear in them. But when he spoke, every thought eddied from her mind.
You have magic, he said. Mind magic.
She stared at him, so startled she couldn't say anything. She tried to wrench herself free of his grasp, tried to push back on his chest. But he snatched her wrist, doubled it behind her, and pulled her against him so she couldn't fight. "Let me go!" she gasped, her free hand clenching in his tunic, her nails digging into the fabric.
You don't deny it.
What? Deny what? Meiling sputtered quickly.
Don't play stupid,
he snarled.
Your games have fooled us long enough. Last night, you spoke in both of our minds. While you slept. You knew about the brigands at the inn.
She was dumbstruck, at a complete loss for how to respond. Should she lie? Could she phrase it so she did not tell a straight denial? What could she even say? If she couldn't convince him that she didn't have magic, he could ruin her, her family, her father. She hesitated too long. She twisted her face away from Shang's unrelenting gaze. To her surprise, he let go of her chin. Fen stood off to the side, arms folded across her chest, bow wrapped around her leg, staring at Meiling like she was a Muagway herself. Shang's face was cut as though from stone, sharp and cold. He was quiet. No doubt his mind worked out all the possibilities, trying to decipher what this could mean and imply for their journey, both what was past and what still beckoned ahead, and how he could leverage this to his advantage. "If you have magic, why didn't you go to the academy?" Fen demanded, stalking a step closer. Meiling glanced from her up to Shang, who still stood much too near for comfort. He studied her closely, waiting for her answer. "Why did you lie to the Empire?" Fen continued. "Why did you make us all believe you were cursed? Why are we on this dragon-blasted journey in the first place? Is it because of your magic? What is going on?" A sob caught in Meiling's throat. She tried to swallow it, but it bubbled up against her lips. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, her chest too tight to draw a full breath. The secret was out. Were all those years pretending to be something that she wasn't, bearing the scorn of her people, for naught? Had she paid the price only to find that what she'd bought was dust? Was all the shadow dodging nothing but a wind that brought no rain? The edges of her vision started to go black, closing in on the sunlight. Shang's arm slid around her waist just as her knees buckled. She fell hard against his chest, trying to blink away the darkness, but it closed in, sure and steady.
"Mount up, Fen,"
barked Shang as he bent, hooked an arm under Meiling's knees, and swept her up into his arms.
"We need to leave."
"But she needs to answer our questions."
"She can't answer them very well if she's unconscious, now can she?"
Meiling clutched fistfuls of his robes, trying not to cry despairing tears against his chest. She couldn't begin to imagine what would happen, what they would do. Would they betray her? "I saved your life," she whispered against his collarbone, the words like a plea.
"What?"
The world was too hot, her heart roaring in her ears as she fought to keep from fully passing out. "I saved your life," she said again, louder than before. It came out like a croak. "Both of your lives." He stopped walking. She tilted her face up toward him, blinking hard. Slowly, her vision cleared. Enough to see his stone-cold expression.
"And you might cost us our lives,"
he replied. Some grateful warrior he was. "Are you going to betray me?" His throat bobbed, his gaze fixed stolidly ahead.
"I suppose that is to be seen, Highness."
He lowered his grip on her knees, allowing her to find her footing. Ironic as it was, he was the only firm thing in a world that spun before her, and she found herself clinging to the man who just admitted he might betray her secret. The only thing keeping her conscious was his arm around her, and the wads of his robes in her fists.
"Can you stand?"
he asked.
"You're white as a sheet."
If he let go of her, she would black out and crumple to the ground. But she hated feeling helpless, so she nodded. He didn't let her go, though, perhaps unconvinced by her answer. Instead, both of his hands grasped her waist firmly, and she sucked in a sharp gasp of surprise as he lifted her up. Into the saddle of his horse, she realized belatedly. He swung up behind her, settling further back in the saddle to accommodate her sideways position. She was warm again, and she had no idea if it was due to her lightheadedness, the startling heat of him against her, or her own flush of embarrassment as his arms reached around her to grip the reins. Then, to her surprise, his hand wrapped around her, gripping her shoulder, and pulled her to lean back against him. Her forehead rested against the column of his neck. He smelled like leather and pine, a startlingly soothing aroma. She stiffened.
"Try to stay conscious," he said. "We have things to discuss."
"In that case," Meiling mumbled, his rapid pulse beating beneath her temple. It was only a touch slower than her own. "I'll just pass out." Did he just snort? It was so subtle she couldn't be sure.
"Ready?"
he barked to Fen. "I'm ready for answers." The horse lurched into motion beneath them, and Meiling closed her eyes against the rocking movements. Never had she gone from the thrill of discovering she wasn't as weak as she'd always thought, that her magic was an untapped well of power, to crashing down into the realization that it was empty. That no matter what kind of magic she had or didn't have, she would always be a slave to her own helplessness. Chapter 15.
"It's time to talk,"
said Shang after a half-hour of blessed reprieve and silence. Meiling shook her head. His impatient exhale stirred the top of her hair. "No more faking fainting to get out of questions," said Fen. Bo was strapped to her front again, but today he wiggled much more than before. Every few minutes, Fen barked at him to stop chewing through her sash or to hold still. Once, the cub even growled back at her.
"You have magic,"
Shang said, ignoring Fen and the panda.
Something pertaining to mind reading or mind manipulation. Explain.
Meiling said nothing. It would be stupid to answer their questions and confirm their accusations. She had not given a verbal admission yet. Perhaps if she said nothing more, her innocence could be preserved before the courts. If she said too much to Shang or Fen, then they could be used as witnesses to her unsanctioned wielding of magic. "He asked you a question," Fen barked. "Answer him."
"She won't answer,"
Shang said, with an understanding nod.
"Because she's a brigand."
At that, Meiling snapped her eyes up to his, the fire returning to burn in her gut. "I am not! I am no brigand!"
"You are not employed in the Emperor's service, though, are you? You are a rogue magic wielder. That makes you a brigand. Should you be discovered, you'd be condemned to death, which is quite a serious situation indeed for you."
He continued his slow nodding, one hand resting on his leg while the other gripped the reins of his horse. He seemed to chew on his next words before saying, carefully,
"Since we are not threatening one another, let's say I have a deal for you."
Meiling bristled, sitting up straight in the saddle. "No deals." She had to fling out both hands, one grabbing the horse's mane, the other grabbing Shang's arm, to keep from falling. He pulled her back against his chest.
"This one works in your favor,"
he said, and she didn't like his tone.
"I propose an exchange. You tell us everything you know about your magic, the real reason behind this journey, and how you're connected to the barbarians. In return, neither Fen nor I will breathe a word of your magic to anyone else."
"What?" Fen demanded. "You're bargaining away our power over her?" So he wasn't going to betray her? And he was going to make sure Fen didn't either? Why didn't this feel like a good thing?
"Would you rather be dead, Fen?"
"Dead? I'm failing to see how this relates."
"We've been attacked once already by brigands, and I'm inclined to believe the Phoenixes last night were connected. Somehow. There is something we don't know about this mission that has put us all at a disadvantage that could cost us our lives. And she knows what it is."
At this, he took hold of her chin, tilting her head back so he could meet her gaze.
"Don't you?"
She stared up at him, lips parting, and swallowed with effort. His own mouth was so close to hers, and staring into his eyes was like staring into a glacier under a starless midnight sky. He let go of her chin. Her head sagged forward, and she stared at the golden glint of sunlight on emerald foliage, growing dizzy watching the trees move past them.
"So, Fen, how much do you value your life?"
Fen only growled in response, turning her back to them. Bow gnawed on her braid. Shang continued.
"We already know you wield magic, Highness. We can decipher with reasonable certainty many of the aforementioned things. And we are under oath to the Emperor,"
he said the word deliberately,
"to report brigands to him. So as you see, I offer you your life."
He looked more like he offered her death and an eternity of torture in DU. Meiling swallowed. "Why should I trust you to keep your oath to me, when doing so would demand you break the oath you made to my father?"
"Would you rather I keep the oath?"
Shang asked easily.
"You have no choice but to trust me. And Fen."
"And Bo," said Fen, who looked about ready to explode with impatience. Meiling turned Shang's words over in her head. He was right. He'd cleanly maneuvered her into a corner and left her no choice. No choice but to entrust them with the secret of her soul. The fire in her blood died. She lowered her head, slumping in defeat against him. "What do you want to know?" she asked finally. She felt rather than saw Shang smile. She shuddered.
Describe your abilities. In detail,
he said. Ahead, the sun crested the horizon and spilled into the forest. The ground grew rockier, making Meiling terrified their horse would slip. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, but she wasn't cold. That is, the breeze was a little chilly. It tugged dead leaves away from the trees, spinning them in the air, and then depositing them onto the ground. Autumn would be here soon. But that wasn't why she needed the security of her cloak bundled around her. Shang did not hurry her as she found the words. Fen, on the other hand, grew antsy with expectancy. She twirled the reins in her hands and dug her nails into the leather. Her lips compressed for a minute, followed by puckering and opening them like she had something to say. Mercifully, she kept quiet except to snap at Bo when he wouldn't stop wiggling or made too much noise. I do not know what my abilities are, Meiling admitted after several long minutes.
That is not a sufficient answer. But I will help you get started,
Shang replied evenly.
You can enter minds or speak telepathically.
Meiling glared up at him, grinding her teeth in agitation. I did enter your minds last night. The confession made the air freeze. Shang and Fen's cheeks paled slightly, despite the fact that she only confirmed what they already knew. They seemed to grapple with the implications of that statement. Did they think she had entered their mind several times, even frequently? The last thing she needed them assuming was that she used her magic flippantly. Quickly, she said, "That was the first time I'd ever done such a thing. I only did it to save you both."
Explain how you saved us.
The blood drained from Fen's face. She had not told Shang that she'd fallen asleep on guard. Now Shang would require an explanation. Meiling should not feel guilty for tattling on Fen, but she did anyway. Meiling closed her mouth. Fen watched her carefully.
You promised to tell everything,
Shang pressed.
How specifically did you save us last night while you were asleep?
Meiling glanced at Fen. I saw the phoenixes before you both did. They moved so fast. I had no choice if I was to warn you before they killed you. Shang lifted his chin, his jaw twitching. She just told a warrior that he would be dead without her. It served him right if he was offended. Hopefully he wouldn't press her more. Let him think this was the extent of her magic.
How could you see the phoenix first if you were asleep?
Shang asked. She was a fool for hoping. Nothing could get past him. She tried to steady her breathing and keep herself upright in the saddle. His threat echoed in her mind as her tongue cleaved to the roof of her mouth. My magic... I can... The right words escaped her. How could she describe it?
You can what?
He prodded. Was that apprehension gleaming in his dark eyes? His brow lowered.
Everything, Highness. That was the deal.
She glanced sidelong at Fen to find she'd wrapped the reins around both hands repeatedly and was squeezing them tightly. Her eyes dilated to the point that they almost took on the glassy sheen of a ferocious animal. She closed her own eyes and focused on making her voice stable. When I fall asleep, my spirit separates from my body. I can see Moagwe and magic wielders from a distance. Their spirits glow, you see.
Everything,
Shang said when she stopped speaking, his voice rumbling in his chest against her. Qiling's curse this helplessness that seeped into every single bone in her body. Why could she not lie? Why did the words, "that is all," refuse to pass through her lips? The truth came tumbling out, despite how her mouth burned with the confessions. I can move through walls. I can fly. I do not have a body. I'm just spirit, and I can fly wherever I want, watch anything, listen to anything. Fen World. You're saying that you've been eavesdropping on us when we had no way of knowing? And that you've been in our minds when we didn't ask? What kind of power is that anyway? I've never heard of such a thing.
Meiling swallowed her next words. Shang said, "You can go as far as you want."
Until my tether pulls taut, then I cannot go further, she mumbled.
Your tether?
Shang prodded. She loathed him for his refusal to back down. She hoped he could see that loathing simmering in her eyes as she tilted her face up to meet his gaze. It binds my spirit to my body, so I can return later. Should she tell them about how the firebird's tether snapped when it died? Absolutely not. Yet somehow, the next word slipped free of her lips anyway. I think we all have tethers. Whether they are different lengths or it requires a unique magic to leave the body, I don't know. Shang went quiet, considering. After another minute, he said,
"You can enter minds. Can you control them?"
His voice softened just barely enough to make Meiling want to trust him and share everything. He almost seemed like he was more curious than conniving now. Or maybe his voice softened because he was afraid of what her answer would be. She refused to trust him. She still had to answer him. Meiling scrunched her brow in concentration. She closed her eyes, the vision returning of his mindscape, the long, grand hallway with the dragon pillars and closed curtains. I don't think so. I think I can mainly listen to thoughts. Her voice trailed off, broken by a new consideration.
What? What else?
He straightened behind her, and his gaze prickled on the top of her head. I might be able to search through memories, she said. I haven't tried, but I think I could. Fear flickered in Shang's eyes, and he turned them away from Meiling to stare at the back of Fen's head.
You can only access these powers while you sleep?
Meiling nodded.
Who knows of your magic?
She shifted uneasily against him. My parents. Now you.
More silence.
Then,
the brigands. They knew, didn't they?
Why did the air keep going colder and colder? With each question, her hands went more numb. I don't know what they knew. They were coming for me. She reached up and tucked a stray hair behind her ear, keeping her eyes downcast. Fen exploded. The Emperor did not think it was important that we knew she was being hunted? That is crucial information. They didn't know. That is, they thought if I was gone from the palace, they wouldn't know where to find me. Meiling's brow puckered. I think if they had thought I was being hunted, they would have sent more wielders. But they knew someone was after you. Hesitantly, she nodded. Fen gusted out a whoosh of an exhale.
How did they know?
Asked Shang. Memories crashed into her mind, a flashing purple and sweat, a leathery hand reaching for her, the cries of her guards, the pained surprise of the intruder when he was shot. Pa vaulting over her bed and shoving her into a corner. Because someone tried to abduct me the night before we left, she said.
What?
Shang demanded.
You were almost abducted? Tell me what happened, Meiling.
Several minutes later, once she had relayed the entirety of the Evanescer episode, and Shang's face was twisted in a mix of fury and consternation, and Fen had taken to ranting aloud about how they should have been told, Meiling mumbled, Is there any food?
Oh, yes,
Shang said. And if she didn't know better, she might have thought that was chagrin in his voice. He looped an arm around her waist, holding the reins, and leaned back to rifle through the saddlebags. Once she was eating, and beginning to feel significantly less lightheaded, Shang returned to their conversation.
They didn't think anyone would discover you'd left the palace, he said. Aside from a Mwagwe or two, we shouldn't have encountered any problems. Nothing that we weren't trained to handle.
So, let me get this straight. Fen twisted in her saddle to stare back at them. This mission has nothing to do with what we were told, but is instead a race to get a magicless princess, who actually does have magic, despite the lies we've been told, to safety before whoever wants her catches up. Oh, and before we get eaten by Mwagwe.
Shang nodded. Seem right to you, Highness?
Meiling nodded numbly.
Is that everything? Or are you hiding anything else from us?
That is everything.
Good. Now tell me about your connection with the barbarians.
Her head swiveled fast as lightning, and she turned earnest eyes up to Shang, who was staring down at her. I truly do not know anything about the barbarians, except that they're amassing on the northern border and might try to conquer Juninghai. That's all I know. That wasn't entirely true. She knew the traditional blessings Ma always mumbled over her food before eating, one of the few things she retained from her own Butagan heritage. There were other things she knew, stories Ma had told her when she was a child, the stories passed down from her Lao Lao when she was young, of a land with blistering winters, of a people who made buffalo tents on wheels so they could always be traveling to keep their herds fed and watered. None of that was relevant to what Shang asked her.
How did the Emperor and Queen discover your powers?
He pried. When would he run out of questions? When would he stop holding her life and secret over her head? When would he simply leave her alone? Before I was born, my mother had a vision, Meiling ground out begrudgingly. Silence reigned for the span of several heartbeats, and she was just beginning to hope this discussion was over. But, of course, Shang wasn't done.
From this point forward, we must work together. You possess magic like us.
She is not like us. Shang fixed Fen with a face of pure indifference.
She wields magic like us.
Clumsily and sneakily.
But still wields it.
His eyelids lowered slightly, betraying his annoyance. He turned to Meiling. His words were sharp, almost threatening.
While you are under our protection, you will obey our rules. Do not enter our minds without either our explicit invitation or for an emergency. Do not listen to our private conversations.
This must be part of the deal.
Yes?
Shang prompted.
You understand?
She gave him one of his own icy glares. Yes, I understand.
We work together now,
he said, looking from Meiling to Fen, daring either of them to argue. Neither did. They rode on in silence. Meiling felt like she'd just sold her soul to DU. Chapter 16. They continued traveling for hours. The landscape grew even rockier and steeper, forcing them to slow their progress. At some point, Shang deemed Meiling recovered enough from her near-fainting spell to sit atop her own horse
without toppling over,
as he put it. She said nothing all afternoon, occupied by her own thoughts, drinking in the vast, brilliant green scenery as if it could erase the numb fear eating away at the back of her mind. Fen and Shang rode ahead together, whispering back and forth so she couldn't hear. Beau's contributions to the conversation were clearly audible, however, and ranged from sporadic enthusiasm to growling irritability. Sometimes she could make out a word or two from Fen, but Shang kept his voice controlled, and it was too deep for her to discern the words anyway. To their left, rice terraces cut into the hillside like bright green stairs. just waiting for her to run up them barefoot. If they traveled down into the valley, they would find a village tucked into the sunshine and fertile grounds, wouldn't they? Not that it mattered, since they stayed off the main roads and avoided villages like death. Shang stopped his horse. Meiling peeked ahead, trying to get a glimpse of his face or what lay ahead.
"Something's not right,"
he said sharply. "I'll scout ahead," Fen said, her eyes bright with brimming excitement. For the first time, Meiling knew what thrilled through Fen's blood. She dumped Bo into a saddlebag, which he protested avidly before he seemed to realize it was the bag with cut-up stalks of bamboo. Then she folded into a hawk and flew high above the treetops. Meiling could only catch snatches of her through the breaks in the shimmering green foliage above them. "What do you think?" Meiling was starting to ask. "Hush!" Shang hissed, spreading his hand back toward her while keeping his sharp eyes fixed ahead. He swung his long legs over the side of the horse and dismounted. His boot crunched on rock when he landed. He flicked both wrists, filling them with tiny, gruesome ice shards. He stepped quietly ahead, slowly. His head twisted quickly from side to side. He halted silently, staring ahead. Meiling tried to stare ahead too, but the only things ahead were towering trees with gray bark and vines swinging between them. The vines themselves, thick and green, hung with more vines. Roots from the trees twisted out from the rocky ground, almost seeming to wrap around the large rocks jutting out of the increasingly steep incline. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. Shang's horse nosed the grass, taking a few uninhibited steps toward the edge of the trail they traveled. Should she dismount too? She decided against it. If Shang had wanted her to dismount, he would have told her. Besides, being on horseback gave her an advantage to flee. Did they think they heard or saw Mwagwe? Or more enemies? Her heart rate increased to a nervous thud, thud, thud. If she were asleep, she could scout the area easier than both of them. Fen landed as a crouched human, one hand on the ground, next to Shang. "All's clear from above." Then she shifted into a huge, snarling wolf. She stuck a wet black nose to the ground and sniffed her way ahead. Shang watched Fen intently. He spared a cursory glance back at Meiling, presumably to ensure she was still where he'd left her. Fen moved quickly, following scents off the trail, then returning and rushing after another. Her shaggy dark gray coat shone coarse in the sunlight. When she had progressed further, her haunches tightened. She released a growl through bared fangs.
"What is it?"
Shang whispered, tense for attack. The ice glittered in his hands from refracted light, casting little rainbows on the ground, his horse, and a nearby tree trunk. The wolf turned her enormous head around to look at Shang, eyes beady and intelligent. Something snapped. Whirling movement plunged toward Fen. She leapt aside, howling ferociously at the vines? Meiling almost screamed when Fen's hind legs were caught by the tangling, twisting, lurching vines. She howled again, trying to bite the vines as they dragged her off the trail, across the rocky ground, and strung her up between the trees. She shifted into human form, but the vines lashed out in a net, catching her before she fell free to the ground. An inhuman roar wrenched from her throat as vines latched onto her wrists and ankles, stretching out her limbs tightly. Shang's eyes darted about frantically, covering every inch of ground. "What are you doing? Help me!" Fen screamed at him.
"If I'm caught too, we're doomed."
Fen screamed again, pulling at her limbs with all her might.
"Is it trying to kill you?"
Shang cried in alarm.
"Or restrain you?"
"I don't know," she wailed.
"Stop fighting it,"
Shang ordered, taking another step closer, hands outstretched. Fen cried out, "If I stop..."
"It'll kill you if you don't. Stop fighting it."
he yelled. She cast a frightened look back at him. Her panic was so strong it made Meiling's heart clench. She sagged in the vine's grip, and they relaxed as well, dropping her a foot in the air and leaving her suspended. A magical trap. Shang took a tentative step closer. He halted immediately, peering up and down suspiciously. Before he could make another move, the vines struck. They shot out, lacing around Shang's ankles so fast he only sliced through one before he, too, was being dragged. He let out a vicious cry when another caught his sweeping, ice-armed hand and yanked him upward into Fen. It was like the net and restraints were alive, almost hungry, and 2 victims would not satisfy. While Shang was grabbed, more came for Meiling. She screamed, trying to turn her horse around and urge it into a gallop. But the vine snatched her wrists and her waist, yanking her off her horse so hard she hit the ground with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. The vines dragged her, ripping her along jagged rocks, but she could not think about the cuts scraping her back, nor the pressure around her waist that threatened to squeeze her in half. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't breathe. She was going to die. This was it. She tried to breathe, but despite how she gasped, she couldn't get air. In! No air came. She panicked, drowning on land. She tried to cry out for help, but she couldn't speak. Not without air. Breathe, a female voice assured. Keep breathing. You'll be all right. Don't panic. Breathe. Fen? Through her bug-eyed vision that saw without seeing, she perceived a face hovering over hers. But she had to focus. Slowly, air started coming. Tiny sips at first, but after a few more minutes, big gulping gasps. Bit by bit, the panic eased, replaced by coherent thought. She could breathe. Think. She became more aware of... Getting the wind knocked out of you is the worst feeling, Fen was saying, her voice strangely sympathetic. You never get used to it. Meiling let out a squeaky scream. She hovered high in the air, suspended only by the death grip of vines on her body. Below, so far below, sharp rocks protruded from the ground, ready to impale her if she fell. Her panic returned in full force. She wrenched against the vines. They tightened, stretching her arms away from her body until it hurt. Meiling screamed a real scream, one of terror and pain.
It's all right. Calm down. Stop struggling.
That was Shang's low voice, and it sounded... behind her? She stopped struggling, trying to breathe. The vines relaxed, making her fall slightly and bump into someone. She whimpered with the effort to hold still as the panic coursed through her.
Deep breaths. You're still winded,
Shang said.
Hold still. Breathe.
Meiling shuddered, knowing she would vomit if she looked down. What do we do?
We wait until we're calm,
he said. Are you scared? She asked. There was a small pause. Then,
yes.
Somehow his admission soothed her, like her terrified hysterics were justified. She took one deep breath, then another. Then she took in their orientation. She hung primarily from her waist, arms held over her head, and both dangling feet fastened. Her weight was distributed enough that no single vine was excruciating, though everything was painfully tight. Fen's face was right near hers. She hung almost entirely upside down from both feet, her hands brought out wide on either side of her. Shang was mostly behind her, except for one leg, which was fastened at what looked to be a strange angle, almost tied to one of Fen's hands. When she relaxed fully, she bumped against Shang's back, behind her head and shoulders.
All calm?
Shang asked.
Fen?
Yes, Meiling quivered. Yeah, I'm calm. But I'm furious, Fen said tartly. Especially that my stupid panda is just eating his bamboo as if nothing is happening.
Forget the panda. We need to make a plan. Let's start with the basics. This is a magic trap, set by someone to presumably catch Mwagwe. It's triggered by magic. We all wield magic. So we were all taken.
Shang began. His breaths were fast and shallow, like he also fought away the frantic rush. What kind of idiot sets a trap that will catch the Emperor's wielders? Fen growled. Who can set a trap like this? Whoever they are, they're a dragon-blasted, phoenix-scorched—
A guardian would,
Shang said, as if it were the most perfectly obvious answer.
To trap Mwagwe.
We're in the territory of Gun Hai, Meiling started to say. How ironic that she was actually applying some of the things she learned while holed up in the library those many hours. Fen's too close face snapped to hers, and it contorted in pain at the movement. We know, brainless. Meiling returned her gaze and continued speaking as evenly as she could around quick, near-frantic puffs of air. And their guardian is Tuan, who has magic pertaining to manipulating vegetation. She could not see Shang's face, but Fen seemed to be surprised.
Indeed,
came Shang's thoughtful reply.
Tuan must have set this, which means he almost assuredly had no intention of catching wielders. This means that there must be some manner of getting free. It seems to have been designed for squirming, thoughtless Mwagwe, which we are most certainly not.
My nose itches, Fen said, wrinkling it. Now that Fen said it, Meiling's nose started itching too, and her arm, just above where the vines were cutting off her blood flow and turning her hands red.
Do either of you see anything strange? A pressure point for the spell or anything similar?
Shang said.
I'm looking on my side.
Meiling pulled her gaze away from Fen's dangling braid and tried to study the trees and vines. Not every vine was engaged in holding them captive. Some hung uselessly nearby. They might not all be spelled. She tried to trace her eyes along them, trying to find where they took root. It gave her a headache trying to follow the twists and tangles. Or perhaps she already had a headache. If I can fall asleep, Meiling said, I could probably find something. Magic usually glows. No one can fall asleep like this, Fen snarled, moving slightly. She gave a short cry when the vines tightened.
You can lean on me if it would help,
Shang offered. I don't know if I can fall asleep, she said, trying to force her tense limbs to relax. As she relaxed, she lowered until she rested against Shang's back behind her head and shoulders. It was taut and hard, not exactly the most comfortable pillow. May I enter your minds? It might get us out faster than if I had to fall asleep several times. You are not entering my mind, Fen snapped. There was silence. Shang, Meiling prompted, too softly for him to hear. He heard anyway.
Yes. Alert me if you do.
She tried to shift, but the vines tightened and she let out a small cry. She steadied her breathing, relaxed her muscles. The vines relaxed, and she closed her eyes. When she did, the bright sunshine turned the inside of her eyelids red. The vine's hold on her waist suddenly turned crushing. She was even more aware and tense with her head leaning on Shang's back. His own strain coursed through his body and into hers, each of his muscles tight with tension. Not quite a relaxing touch. Falling asleep like this was impossible. She tried to slow her breathing, to take one big soothing lungful steadily after another. Her heart rate slowed down almost imperceptibly. Shutting her eyes tighter, she tried to imagine she was back home, in her soft bed. Her mother had just said goodnight and was leaving after blowing out the candle. Meiling could almost hear her soft footfalls. No, she couldn't imagine it. Not with these vines crushing her. She tried something else. She imagined curling up in a ball on the tent floor. The wrists of her sleeves and the ankles of her trousers were far too tight, and she wore Shang's belt notched to the tiniest, most constricting hole. The thought made her almost smile, but she caught herself. The vines around her stomach loosened. Patiently, Meiling took every sensation and rewrote its story to convince herself it was safe enough, that she was tired enough, to fall asleep. It felt like 100 years, and it might have been a full hour, but Meiling was so concentrated, she did not realize when she actually drifted to sleep until her soul slipped free of her body. Relief coursed like water through her. Now they had a chance of getting out of this.